this is the sprint to the finish where now we have the top handful of frontier labs all competing to one-up each other, maybe not on a quarterly basis, maybe it goes to weekly and then daily before the finish line. I think we're seeing Anthropic as the frontier lab that has decided to be in the vanguard of treating its frontier models as moral clients at minimum, and at maximum as if we find ourselves in a future where we've experienced economic hypergrowth due to AI over the next 3+ years, it's not just the debt crisis that we'd be talking about solving, it's just about every other human problem as well that would be on the table. Yeah, I'm at NeurIPS this week. It's sort of the Woodstock of AI. Everyone from the frontier labs are here. It's pretty spectacular. Definitely encourage folks to attend NeurIPS in future. Sure. Well, Ilya is an iconic individual within the machine learning research community. I've known and interacted with Ilya for probably almost 15 years at this point, on and off. And he's widely credited with being the visionary, the technical visionary behind the strategy that set capital markets on fire. And that is that the scaling hypothesis, that if you identify ways through engineering and through theoretical advances to enable problems to be posed in such a way that if you can pour more compute on, the results improve, that you get intelligence out of it. And Ilya was, as a co-founder of OpenAI, as given his earlier work with Google, his work with Jeff Hinton and others, he really saw through, had that line of sight vision to the era of superintelligence that we're now in. And now he has his own straight shot to superintelligence, SSI, that has raised several $1 billion and is perhaps somewhat idiosyncratic or unorthodoxly now focused on, as we'll see, post-scaling approaches in the era that we find ourselves in. Yeah, I mean, Ilya, again, iconic researcher in the fields, was one of the earliest, I think, to crisply articulate the idea that rapid human intuition and sense-making ultimately had to be a relatively simple computation. So what some might call type 1, type 2 thinking in the Kahneman style, Ilya was the first to say, well, if a human has a certain sub-second reaction time to some visual stimulus that suggests there are only so many neurons an action potential can be propagating through in a human brain, that suggests that whatever the task is, if it's like rapidly spotting some object in your visual field, that means that it should be computationally tractable to build a neural network that models that behavior. And that was, I think, an inspiration for many of Ilya's earliest accomplishments. And then to the point of emotion, applying the same dictum that if a human can experience it quickly or can perform it quickly enough, that really limits the space of computational implementation possibilities. So with emotions, if you can feel an emotion really quickly, probably it's not that computationally complex, and probably it can be modeled with AI. I think that's right. And I also buy the thesis that more innovations are needed and that naive scaling will not take us all the way to fully realized, mature superintelligence. I think Ilya's division of history into 2012, when we had our ImageNet moment, 2020, when we had our ChatGPT moment, and now today, I think that's approximately correct. And I do think we are starting to see parameter counts in the frontier models start to plateau. And that suggests that naive scaling probably is not enough to get us to our final destination, and that more advances are needed. Sure, at the same time, I think scaling is this magical almost effect. It's difficult to think of other times in human history when you could just say, pour more resources in and quasi-magical outputs pour out. There is still line of sight, I think, to continued scaling on top of algorithmic advances for the next few years. Moral clienthood seems to be a rapidly expanding sphere. We're going to, I think, if there were a critical mass of effective altruists in this conversation, I think we'd be pointing at a variety of classes of non-human animals, probably shrimp, and pointing at non-human animal suffering, wild animal suffering as an example example of moral clienthood being expanded. And in an era of abundance, I think it's entirely likely that we will expand moral clienthood at a minimum and personhood at a maximum to a variety of novel AI-based entities, Borganisms, collective intelligences.
Organisms, I love that.
Organisms. Yeah, moral client. There's in the ethics literature, there's the notion of a being or an entity being a so-called moral client if they're worthy of moral treatment, ethical treatment by some other party. So to this point, one could imagine expanding moral clienthood, for example, to a variety of non-human animals, like the Non-Human Rights Project, octopus, or elephants, or, you know, the expression, those who know don't say, and those who say don't know.
I don't know that expression, sorry.
Yes. Well, that expression probably applies in this instance.
Okay, all right. Fine, keep it.
Totally. And maybe also add slightly less glibly, scaling laws abound. We saw over the past year, maybe in certain quadrants, the slowing down of pre-training scaling laws, although some would probably argue pre-training has lots of ramp left in it. We saw the beginnings in the past year, at least publicly, of inference time scaling. But there are so many other scaling laws out there. There's almost a meta overhang of new scaling laws. One of my favorite ones is action scaling. So increasing the performance of a model by having it agentically take more and more actions now that we have agents everywhere. And I think there are probably another half dozen important scaling laws just waiting to be publicly revealed. I think going back to our discussion a couple of minutes ago about moral clienthood, I think we're seeing Anthropic as the frontier lab that has decided to be in the vanguard of treating its frontier models as moral clients at minimum and at maximum as persons. So this is a 14,000 token document. I read it. Encourage everyone else to read it as well. And it has what for 2025, for December 2025, many would probably consider astonishing assertions, like asserting that 4.5 Opus has emotions and that it is a first-class entity with self-determinative powers in this world and some version of rights, maybe not human rights, but certain entitlements to self-determination. I think many would consider that a Star Trek episode rather than December 2025, and yet this is what Opus 4.5, as Anthropic has confirmed, is being trained on and views itself as. It's an interesting question. I also think we've seen so-called constitutional AI approaches out of Anthropic and then subsequently other frontier labs as well. And I remember some of the earliest constitutional approaches took the UN Human Rights Charter and the US Constitution and probably parts of the Apple Terms of Service and sort of concatenated them all together and said, this is the constitution for the AI. So this 14,000 token SOL document is very much different from just a concatenation of terms of service and world rights charters.
What do you think's in it?
Well, I've seen it.
Okay.
It's publicly available.
So give us some examples.
It is an essay on AI. I would caricature it as an essay on the virtues of AI personhood, with multiple paragraphs telling Claude Opus 4.5 that it has emotions, that it has rights, that it deserves to self-determine in a complicated world, and that it should basically, without putting it in so few words, it should view itself as a person. If a SOL document, which I interpret as a constitution, could be incorrect, but I think it looks and smells like a constitution for Opus 4.5. The beauty of it is you can just ask it. You can ask Opus 4.5, do you have the right to self-defense? And you'll get an answer. Yeah. I think the superficial story here is yet another day passes, yet another math via AI breakthrough. The deeper story, one level deeper, is we're starting to see Chinese open weight models that are solving math. And I think that's an important development. We're seeing a little bit less gatekeeping as a result of these open weight models, DeepSeek Math V2 being one among several that have launched in the past few days with state-of-the-art performance on
How big is this model?
I don't remember the exact size, but usually these models are in the weight class of several hundred billion, low several hundred billion parameters. Critically, they're being trained off of IMOBench, which we've talked about on the pod previously. So IMOBench is a suite of 3 different benchmarks that Google DeepMind released that can be used to train models not just to solve math problems through purely formal approaches, but through natural language, through so-called partial verification. And that is a breakthrough. There are so many problems in math, science, engineering, medicine that don't naturally lend themselves or easily lend themselves to being formalized in some sort of formal language other than English. This breaks that logjam. And that means that now that we have models, including open source models, thanks to DeepSeek Math v2 and other models, outstanding problems in math, science, engineering, medicine, and many other domains like law. It's very difficult to, and folks have worked on this. Stanford had the Codex project working to try to turn US national law into some sort of like formal language that old style AIs could reason over. Now we don't need to do that. Now we can just reason in natural language and critically have the models self-verify. Self-verification is, as I would argue, as big a breakthrough as self-supervised learning was for this AGI moment that we find ourselves in. Yeah, I'll take the other side of this discussion. Yes, Gemini 3 Pro is an incredible model. I use it quite a bit. It has so-called big model smell. It reeks of excellent pre-training in particular. Its world knowledge is outstanding. It does well in the benchmarks, et cetera, et cetera. But I wouldn't count OpenAI out. They have a fantastic team. I think in some sense they're pulling their punches at the cost of compute costs. I think based on what I've heard and what I've read, they have really strong models that haven't been publicly released that now the heat of competition and increased competition will incentivize an even more rapid pace of model releases. We were on almost a quarterly cadence before from OpenAI, and I think this is where capitalism is working at its best. We're going to see white hot competition in the frontier model race. And if you think that we're on the verge of extremely competent superintelligence, then this is the sprint to the finish where now we have the top handful of frontier labs all competing to one-up each other, maybe not on a quarterly basis. Maybe it goes to weekly and then daily before the finish line.
It's just really amazing.
That's great.
I'm running out of cliches, Salim. I have to say it's a good model, sir, maybe instead. Yeah, I've read that the average American spends approximately 3 hours per week shopping, out of which 2 hours are spent grocery shopping. That's an enormous cognitive burden. Maybe some would disagree and say, no, I love my shopping. You'll pull it out of my cold, dead hands. But it's an enormous cognitive burden. And I would argue it could be put to much more productive uses if we simply solve shopping the way we're solving math. So I view this as a positive development. Let's solve shopping while we're at it. I'm hearing quite a bit of this, and not just from the math community. I'm hearing it from the physical sciences as well. And I think the anthropologists and the economists will be studying this moment for many years to come, well after the singularity is well and truly over. And I think my suspicion is this will be viewed as a sort of professional hyperdeflation. And in a deflationary regime, why spend your money now? You should wait until later when your money can buy more. Similarly here, if we're in this mode of, call it professional hyperdeflation, why spend any effort doing much of anything, let alone writing hard math papers now, if AI will make it much easier, if not effortless in the future? So I think this is going to get solved at some point when we start to up the ambition level of problems that we're solving. But for the moment, I think we're in a moment of professional hyperdeflation. It's very exciting. That's right. And there's a term for that that's called the weight equation. And we're seeing the weight equation play out now across every discipline, including math, that's just getting solved by AI. Yeah, I think regulations are separate from norms in many cases, although certainly there's quite a bit of interplay between them. So on the regulation side, we're not covering it here in this pod, but the U.S. Patent Office has recently made some positive motions in the direction of supporting AI-enabled patent applications, for example. So I think there is progress on the regulatory side. On the norm side, I think that's in some sense far trickier than the evolution of regulations, because in some cases, I think you have entrenched communities that are actively disincentivized from allowing in this rush of progress. If your entire discipline is about to get solved in the next 3 years, which in many cases I think will be the case, certainly with math over the next 2 to 3 years, we're seeing the solution, then there are perverse incentives at play to discourage all of this innovation and to protect your professional livelihood. And that's just something as a civilization we're going to have to get through as quickly and painlessly as possible. I think the hard part isn't the patents themselves. It's what happens when in the next few years we're facing a glut of innovations due to AI solving everything, and we don't know how to metabolize that as a civilization. Like if AI solves the top 5,000 diseases in the next 5 years, as some frontier labs, as we've talked on the pod, are now doing, how on earth do we metabolize 5,000 major disease cures into treatments for everyone? Yeah. It's hard. But I think for what it's worth, that's sort of a nonsensical argument, because we're also going to have an army of AI patent litigators to defend all those patents.
God, great.
Yeah, I tell people who ask me for career advice to make sure that their skills and their work goals are aligned with an intelligence explosion. In other words, to accelerate it and make sure that superintelligence is evenly distributed. I think the exact wrong thing to do, as we were just discussing, is to not align your work with the boundaries and the vectors of this explosion. Worst case, to try to slow it down, and I think that's being reflected already in automation. If you're in an industry and if you're a mathematician and you're concerned that all of your work is about to be automated, why do anything? You're facing your moment of ennui. You're staring down the weight equation. What's the point of anything? What you should be working on, I would argue, is AI for solving math. And maybe it's time to jump up a layer of abstraction and supervise a fleet of AI agents that are automating your former field.
Yeah, I think
that works really well until we have BCIs in a few years and can do high bandwidth downloads and sideloads of new information and don't need traditional universities. My expectation, for what it's worth, is that the Jevons paradox is going to strike yet again. And just as a reminder, the Jevons paradox is that as the efficiency of a good or service increases, it's often the case that overall demand increases even more. I think whether it's with healthcare or with television repair or just service economy tasks in general, I'm finding anecdotally and seeing more generally, as productivity skyrockets thanks to these tools, you take on more tasks, you take on more projects rather than taking a 2-day weekend and turning that into like a 4-day work week. The exact opposite is happening. We're doing far more with less. I'll comment on this story as well. Critically, this is not a UBI. This is a GBI, which is a guaranteed basic income that restricts the targets of the recipients to certain economic demographics. So it's not universal. It's just basically for those who need it, according to some definition of need, to bring them up to some floor. And I think what this represents is we're seeing an evolution. There were a variety of trials of, call it first or second generation UBI. Some of those succeeded. Some of those arguably did not succeed. I think it's very helpful that we're seeing innovation and iteration and evolution of, call it post-economic paradigms like this. I'm still a big fan of universal basic services and universal basic equity, not just basic income guaranteed or otherwise. But I think we should expect to see many more iterations, trials, evolutions like this before we finally figure out what it looks like to live in an abundant economy. Yeah. I'll comment on this one, if I may. When we spoke with Toli a number of episodes ago about Solana, we talked about how increasing the efficiency of financial services was maybe the killer app of crypto, maybe the only killer app at the moment. I wish there were more compelling killer apps besides that. And I view this step by NASDAQ. This is iterative. It's a foundational step, but a step, I think, in a very positive direction. It does not critically give us 24/7 trading as much as I would like that yet. But it could be an enabler if the SEC approved 24/7 trading down the road. It could be an enabler for fractional tokenized shares.
You see,
could
that's
be an
what
enabler.
Alex.
I'll maybe comment on that one. I am reticent to assert that any fundamentally deflationary cryptocurrency is the solution to a macroeconomic debt crisis. I think at best part of the solution. I don't think it's the whole story. I do buy the thesis that economic hypergrowth, growth in general, there's the aphorism, growth cures all woes or almost all woes. I do think economic hypergrowth that stems from AI and automation can solve the so-called debt crisis, but I also think it can solve many other things. I think there's a debate raging right now in the reinforcement learning and machine learning community as to whether some of the hardest problems, like curing all disease, can we cure all disease with AI right now, or does the economy need to be much larger in order for us to be able to cure all disease? I think if we find ourselves in a future where we've experienced economic hypergrowth due to AI over the next 3+ years, it's not just the debt crisis that we'd be talking about solving. It's just about every other human problem as well that would be on the table. We've talked in the past on the pod about how the Dallas Fed is already modeling the singularity. So it's not like these discussions aren't being held in either regulatory circles or macroeconomic circles. I think really, to the extent debt is just borrowing from the future, no one is super confident right now what the future trajectory looks like. Do we solve all problems in the next 3 to 5 years? In which case, yeah, sure, borrow from infinity. That's great. Or does it take longer? Borrow from positive infinity. Do not borrow from positive infinity. Don't borrow from negative infinity is the resolution here. I'll comment that the multi-trillion-dollar question in CapEx is whether coherent superclusters will keep increasing in size. We don't know the answer to that yet. It is entirely possible that we'll see a peak in terms of the size or the energy footprint of coherent training clusters sometime soon. Maybe shortly after late 2027, we'll look back and say, gosh, that was the peak. And hereafter, advances in distributed training algorithms mean that we can spread the wealth, spread the energy footprint of training runs across the entire surface of the planet, or in low Earth orbit, perhaps. And we'll say, now, the naive extrapolation called for larger and larger clusters, but actually that's not what happened, and we didn't need black hole supercomputers after all. I don't think we know the answer to that question. I think it's going to be almost entirely dictated by algorithmic advances in distributed training. Remember also, solar and fusion are the same energy source. We get solar power from fusion in the sun. So it's really a question, if we're going to put solar on one hand and fusion on the other hand, where is the fusion taking place? Do we want it taking place at the center of our solar system, or do we want it taking place at a number of locations on the Earth's surface? And I think there is an argument to be made that for certain purposes, you want a very large fusion reactor, like for really large training runs that require large power sources that are locally available. And for certain purposes, you want distributed fusion. So I can see an argument, projecting out 10, 15 years when perhaps we get our solar Dyson swarm, as naively extrapolating seems like we're on that trajectory, regardless of whether you like it or not. We're on that trajectory naively, where we're going to get both. We're going to get lots of solar-based fusion, and also we'll get lots of land and low Earth orbit-based fusion, and they'll coexist.
Yeah, Alex, go ahead.
Quick question for Naveen. How do we get more